Good evening, everybody. It's good to have people tuning in with us and from home, and glad that you're able to be on the live stream with us tonight on this cold February night. We're going to be tonight in Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. Before we go there, I want to make a couple announcements that we want to make sure and let everybody know about. Robin Dickin messaged me a few minutes ago and asked me to make sure that we made it aware that she wants to thank everybody for the prayers on her behalf and her family. And she said that the pain kind of comes and goes with her arm, but hopefully this coming Thursday she'll find out whether or not a cast will suffice or whether she'll need to have surgery on her arm. And certainly want to hope and pray it's just a cast that she needs. I also want to mention that the elders are going to meet next Sunday at 5. If you are able to come out and want to come out to meet with them next Sunday afternoon, you can do that. And as always, make sure you let us know if you have any needs of anything. We'd be glad to help you in whatever way we can. As far as for tonight, just remember we consider this a class, so feel free to make comments or questions. We certainly appreciate those. We had a lot of comments on Wednesday night, and it was especially good, and I'm thankful for that. I really appreciate you making those comments, and so hopefully we'll have some of those this evening. Tonight we're going to look at the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15. I would say, in my opinion, I've read this before, that outside of the gospel itself, okay, obviously the gospel is the greatest story ever told. But I'd say outside of the gospel itself, I'd say that the parable of the prodigal son is the greatest story ever told. If you want to look at it in this light, if you would look at the parables as maybe a short story, you could say it's a remarkable piece of literature when you recognize what it is, and thinking about how masterful Jesus teaches this story, and how wonderful it is, and how multi-layered that the parable of the prodigal son is. We've been looking at several of the parables of Jesus throughout the last several weeks, and so when we look at this one, I regard it, of course, as certainly as the greatest of the parables, because in reality, this story is the story of mankind. We've all been at some point, maybe we didn't go clear to a literal far country, but every one of us has been lost and been found. Every one of us at some point has been separated from God, and every one of us comes back. Also, every one of us has likely, maybe at some point, been the older brother in which he didn't leave. And so we can all recognize and we can all feel something in this account, because this reaches to every one of us. Well, the parable of the prodigal son is not the only parable in that chapter. It has two more parables in it. One of them is the parable of the lost sheep. And if you'll remember back, I don't remember exactly which week, but it's been a month or two ago, we did the parable of the lost sheep as one of our parables. If you remember when we talked about it, it's all theory, it's all a story until you are the lost sheep, until you're the one lost. And then what does it take? How important it is, how significant it is. And we talked about that and talked about the rejoicing in heaven when one returned. And so the parable of the lost sheep, as we looked at, was certainly one that is very significant, very important. Well, in that parable, there's a lost sheep, and in the next parable in the chapter is a lost coin, and the one we're going to talk about tonight is the lost son. But there is a lost coin, and it's verses 8 through 10. And a woman has 10 silver coins. Now, more than just being 10 silver coins, this is probably an amount for a dowry. Usually, when you got married, the woman would have a stockpile of either goods or money that went with her to help them start their family. And you would do that, and usually that was an average person's possible dowry. And so those 10 silver coins represented her marriage, her freedom from the family that she was from. And so it's a lot. It's not just a coin. It's much more like losing a wedding ring or losing an engagement ring. So not only do these coins have a monetary value, they have a sentimental value. And so, losing these coins, she's going to look for it. And, if a woman loses a ring, an engagement ring, a wedding ring, what are they going to do? They're going to turn the whole house upside down trying to find that, because it's that significant, it's that important. And so very much she did that, and when she finally found it, she rejoiced and she was happy. And so she wanted to let her friends and family know that she had found that. Well, said there would be joy with the angels in heaven over one sinner that repents. If you don't get anything out of all of these parables, all three of them, realize the value of one soul, one sinner in the eyes of God. And so I think if we wanted to do a better job in being the kind of people that we should be, being the kind of evangelists we should be, doing what we ought to do, then we ought to have a higher value of the individual soul, the individual sinner that's lost. And if we focused on those people that are lost, then we would bring ourselves to be a part of that rejoicing as well. So very much there is joy in heaven when one returns. And so now we'll get specifically into the parable. Now that we've looked at some of these things and looked at these individual ones, one more thing on the context. In the very beginning of the chapter, tax collectors and sinners were drawing near him, and the other people, the Pharisees, the scribes, they were grumbling and saying about Jesus that he eats with sinners. And so Jesus is pointing out the value and the importance of the tax collectors, the sinners, and their soul. And so how important it is that they be brought back. And that was the context of these parables. Verse 11. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out of one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. We'll pause the story right there and look at it. I said to you this morning, as I mentioned, that we were going to look at the parable of the prodigal son, and we're going to, in particular, look at it through the eyes of love and thinking about love in relation to it. Like I said, I think it's the greatest story ever told outside the gospel itself. And the big reason why, it's because of God's redeeming love. In the parable, as Jesus tells it, clearly the understanding is that God is the Father. God is the one. It's God's house, and God who is the one who is extending his grace and mercy. And so what is interesting about that, if God is the Father in the prodigal son story, then why does God let him go to the far country? Well, what is that reason? Well, the reason is, I would say, it's love. Now, the young man was going to mishandle and misuse the things that he'd been given. And he was going to make some mistakes. But sometimes you have to make your own mistakes. And God was willing to let him, the Father was willing to let him go and make those mistakes. Now, that doesn't make them any less of a mistake. Doesn't make them any less wrong, any less sinful. You know, sometimes people will say, well, you know, this is what I'm going to do, and God, if you don't want me to do it, stop me. You ever hear that or ever try that or whatever? That's tempting God. I don't know if you realize that, but that's what that is. And that's kind of what he was doing. He was running off to go to a far country with all this money and to go off there to do who knows what. But he is able to go on that. Well, why is there all the bad things in the world? Well, why is that? Why are things not a utopia in this world? And a lot of people will blame God for it. You see, people might look at this story. Was it God's fault? Was it the Father's fault what this young man did? Was the Father at fault? Well, no, the Father wasn't at fault. The Father didn't tell him to go to the far country and ruin all his reputation and lose all his money. It wasn't like he was going into the far country to start a business. He didn't go off to buy a farm or a vineyard or something like that. No, he was going off to spend it on reckless and riotous living. And so, you know, why is that? Why does God allow us to make so many mistakes?
There's a song that's called "That's My Job," and the story of the song is the father lets his son go out west, pays half his fare, and the son says, "What if I don't do well out there? How am I going to get back home?" And the father said, "I'll pay your way back home because that's my job."
Yeah, that's true. Andy mentions a song that, you know, about that's my job, about a father paying his son to go out, to go out west to make his fortune or whatever. And, you know, what if he fails? The father says, well, I'll send you the money to get you back because that's my job. And yeah, there are some things like that, but sometimes we just have to let people make mistakes. Now, if you are the young person, okay, if you're listening to me and you are the young person, maybe you're a late teenager or in your 20s or whatever, and you're sitting there thinking, yeah, I want to go make my own mistakes. This comes with a massive, massive warning, okay? You know, you can end up losing your life making poor decisions. And I've known people that have done that. So going into the far country and living like a heathen is a terrible idea at any age. And so I'm not suggesting to do this. I'm not suggesting anybody ought to do this and live in such a way. But recognize that, you know, the reason for this is that you know, he needed to learn. And as I'm getting comments here pretty fast, you know, that certainly it's free will, and that's exactly right. That, you know, it's God gave him the opportunity to make his choices. Now, understand this. God gives every single one of us in this world the chance to make our own decisions and to make our own mistakes. And as I got a message from Paul that Paul Hott, that he says, you know, we need to learn by those mistakes. And yeah, that's very true. And so we get the chance to learn from those mistakes that we make. And yes, you know, God has given us the opportunity to choose right and wrong. And when we choose wrongly, we suffer the consequences. Now, we have the right to choose, but we do not have the right to choose the consequences that come. And see, here this young man went and he spent all that money. Well, what was the consequence? There's no more money. And where does he find himself? He finds himself sitting in a field feeding pigs. And so, we have that to look at. And so, Kevin sent me a message from the back room. He says, when Jesus told this parable, the sinners and tax collectors were gathered around him. The Pharisees, or like the older brother, wanted nothing to do with these people. It was a warning against the Pharisees and the unjust to adjust their hearts, or they would miss heaven. And that's true. And we would miss heaven too if we acted in such a way. But every one of us has to have the opportunity to make our own mistakes. But we will be judged by those, and we need to learn from those, and free will and free choice is one of the greatest things God's given to us. But with free will and free choice comes the fact that we will have to suffer consequences when we don't use that free will and choice to choose God. Yeah, Tom?
One thing I always think about those consequences, those are not always short-lived.
No, they're not.
You may live with those consequences the rest of your life.
Yes, you may get forgiveness for murder or whatever. You can get forgiveness for murder, but you might still have to serve life in prison for it. Yeah, there's consequences that may live with you for the rest of your life. If you were to make a bad choice and you were to get drunk, for instance, and you cause an accident and you kill somebody, you might not get but 2 or 3 or 4 years or whatever in prison, but you're going to live with the conscience for the rest of your life for making such a bad decision. And, you're going to have to live with that. Now, you can be forgiven of it. Don't misunderstand. There's grace, and there's mercy, and there's forgiveness for anything that we're willing to repent of and seek forgiveness of. But doesn't mean there aren't going to be scars. Doesn't mean there's not going to be pain. Doesn't mean there's not going to be difficulty from that. Sometimes we look at the Apostle Paul and his thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians 12. And one thing that, we don't know what that thorn in the flesh is, but I do think that there's something with that thorn in the flesh that goes with the memories of what he did before he became a Christian, of seeing Stephen and seeing others in their pain and their suffering and how that he put them to death. I believe that, if you've ever seen somebody stoned to death, and I haven't, and I doubt you have either, but if you've ever seen somebody stoned to death, you probably don't forget it. I can't imagine Saul and later Paul ever forgetting the death of Stephen, being stoned to death, and all that went with that. And so I would imagine the face of Stephen haunted him for the rest of his life because of what he had done. Even though he had grace for it, even though he had mercy for it, even though he had forgiveness for it, I guarantee you he never forgot the face of Stephen when he was stoned, and he held the coats for those that did that. Got another comment here. If somebody doesn't want to be mentioned, that they mentioned that part of love is letting us make our mistakes occur, but the consequences come, and it doesn't protect us from the consequences. That's very true. God doesn't keep us sometimes from the consequences. We can't just pray and it'll all be better. Sometimes we still have to suffer with those. We learn from the consequences, and that's true, and it's important that we do that. And sometimes that's how we get to where we need to be in terms of growing, because we suffer because of what we've gone through. And it's very important that we learn that. It's very important that we go from that. You see, in this story, all these comments that everybody's been making is exactly right, because this man spent all his money and he found himself in a field feeding pigs. And Rodney sent me a message a little while ago, and certainly this is true, that a young Jewish man, which a pig was an unclean thing, would have been about the most disgusting and detestable thing on the planet to feed and to be around. And I tell you what, I've not been around pigs a lot, but I know one thing: I have never coveted what they ate. I never wanted to be up and belly up to the trough right there with them, because they eat some pretty disgusting things. And, you know, I've never really wished I could eat what they ate. And so, you know, certainly we have the knowledge that he had life hit him pretty hard. And life needed to hit him hard. But you know what? That's where love all came in. Now, I want to cover a couple things before we move along. You know, God loved him enough to let him go. And God loved him enough to let him have the money to go with him. And as the Father did that. And you know what? He probably had some friends while he had the money. He probably had a bunch of people around him while he had the money. I mean, let's face it, most everybody does. If the money's flowing, you'll have, quote unquote, friends. People that you might think like you or maybe even love you. But you know what? That's not love. And so much of the world looks at maybe the amount of people they have as friends on Facebook, or how many people that want to be around them when they're the life of the party, or how many people want to party with them or whatever. And there's so many people, and I'll tell you, I've seen, and I'm not judging any particular ones, but I think it's pretty apparent that a lot of the celebrities over the years, over the last 50 or so years, that found themselves overdosing on drugs or alcohol or whatever and dying. And the list is immense. Dozen upon dozen of famous people that we could list that have died due to accidental overdoses due to drugs and alcohol. And many of these people, you would look at them and think their life was storybook, perfect, with millions and millions of dollars in their bank account, with people all around them, stadiums filling up to listen to them, movie theaters filling up to watch them in a movie. But you know what's a common occurrence? That when you talk to their friends, that it's found out that they were miserable, that they were down, that they were discouraged. And you look at their life and you think, how could they be? With all of that money, with all of those people looking up to them, all of those people surrounding them. And I see very much this man that while the money flowed, there were people all around him. But when he hit hard times, when it was the still dark part of the night, when the money was gone, when the famine kicked in and everybody was thinking about themselves, who exactly were his friends? And the friends got pretty few and far between. Well, these quote-unquote friends were willing to help him spend the money, willing to help him spend the inheritance. But they weren't there when he was down. Now, what I want to say about that is, a lot of what people think is love, what a lot of people think is friendship, what a lot of people think is companionship, is really not. And it's so important that we recognize the real thing. Because especially young people, as you go into the world, as you go into college, as you get out into the world and you start making a living and you start going into the world, you will recognize there will be a lot of these quote-unquote friends around you. And they may be willing to help you spend your money. They may be willing to help you if you can do something for them or whatever. But I want you to realize that the people that care about you, care about your soul, care about your eternity, those are the people that really are your friends. Those are really the people that love you, the people that will want to help you. But, a lot of times in life, there's people that you think are your friends, but when it comes down to it, they're going to scramble, they're going to run, they're going to hide. Well, the prodigal son realized the only place he could go, when he looked for love in the far country, when he looked for happiness, when he looked for joy in the far country, it was not there. What he did find was hollow, it was meaningless, and it was over quick. And then when he needed love, when he needed help, who was there? One man said, hey, go out there and feed my pigs. And no, don't eat anything they're eating. He couldn't even get any food from that. And so you think about that, how that really was. We have a lot of people in this world that are living in the pig pen of life. And they don't see any hope. They don't see any good. In fact, some of those people might even be wealthy in monetary terms, but they're living in the pigsty of life, and they don't realize what they've done, don't realize what they're doing. But the great thing happened, a remarkable thing happened. What was important happened is verse 17. He's hungry. He's in the field with the pigs. But what does verse 17 say? But when he came to himself. You know what that means? He was outside of himself for a while. He was chasing ravenously after sin and wickedness and whatever he was doing in the far country. He wasn't thinking about home. He wasn't thinking about what was right. He was just thinking about what he wanted to do that day. He'd been living a selfish life, and now he found himself there right in the middle of the pig pen with the pigs, so hungry he wants to eat what they're eating, and he comes to himself. And sometimes that's what it needs to take place. Sometimes we need that. Rodney just mentions me that sometimes we have to hit rock bottom. Maybe for this parable, we ought to amend that. You got to hit the mud where the pigs are. Got to hit the bottom of the mud and wallow in the mud where the pigs are to realize you don't want to be there anymore. To realize you're down in this mire and this muck, and you want out of that, and you want to change, and you're sick and tired of the place and the position that you're in, and you want free from it. And so he came to himself. He came to himself, and what does he say? In verse 17 again, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. What has been missing from his life when he left home? He's been beside himself. He's been outside of himself. When he came to himself, what does he realize? He realizes how good it is back home. That house that he wanted away from, that life that he wanted to leave, there were probably rules he didn't like in that household. There were probably standards in that household he didn't like, and he wanted away from there, and he wanted away from there as fast as he could. And now, it wasn't so bad back there after all. It wasn't so bad back there because you know what? Even the servants, everybody has everything they need in that household. I've come to realize that it's important for all of us, especially us that are adults a little further on in life, that we try to have a household that's like this. I hope my kids are able to stay in life and they're able to continue to do what's right. But you know what? If life hit them hard, I know my kids know, and I hope they would always know that they could come back home if they needed to. And I think all of us, especially that are adults, that are older, that we should have a household that we can help our kids know that they can come back home. They can come back to the Father's house. And you know what? The fact that the Father's house was consistent, the fact that the Father's house was a house with love, that everybody in the Father's house was treated with respect, everybody in the Father's house had food to eat, everybody in the Father's house, even the servants, were given what they needed. And so he said, I'll just go be a servant in my Father's house. You know what he also notices? He notices that even though he's done all these things, he says, I have sinned. In verse 18, that the love that was within him that he remembered back from the Father's house had stirred a repentance within him. And this repentance caused him to realize, I've sinned, I've done wrong. And I want to go back and I want to seek forgiveness. And you notice he says, I've sinned against heaven and before you. Another reason why I view that this is clearly talking about God as the Father here, because God's the one that we should confess to. God's the one that we need to come back to. And he says, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. He says, I'm going to say, I'm no longer to be worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. That's what he asked for. He arose, verse 20, and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He is lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. You know, one thing about love is love waits and love watches and love hopes. And that's exactly what that father did. He knew the son had made a mistake when he left. He knew that was going to happen. And he knew that as his son came back, he knew how his son walked. You know, if you've got a family member that's really close to you, you can pick them out at a distance, can't you? And imagine he looks at him, and as he sees him top the rise and he's starting that way, I would imagine the son had a few less pounds. He was probably a little thinner, but he recognized that walk. I would also imagine that maybe the son walked a little faster going away from when he left. This time he might be walking a little slower. But at any rate, the father doesn't have to be told who it is. He knows. He's clearly been watching. He's clearly been waiting. And you know what? If you are lost and you're separated from God, I can tell you without any hesitation and without any doubt, He's watching and He's waiting for you to get your life right with Him. We looked this morning at John chapters 13 through 17, and we noticed how that Jesus said that we're His friends if we do what He's commanded, and that we abide in the love of God when we obey His commandments. And so that's how we show love for God. That's how we how we have love with God. And so God loves you, and He wants you back. And if you've gone into the far country and you've made all kinds of mistakes and you've sinned and you've separated yourself from Him, well, you need to repent. You need to come back. But you know one thing? He's going to take you back. You notice that the father runs to him, something that Jewish men wouldn't do, because you know what? They were essentially, for lack of a better term, dresses. They were togas. You know, ladies could probably address this a lot better, but there's not really a dignified way to run in a dress, especially one that's really long. What do you pretty well have to do? You pretty well have to grab the bottom of it and hike it up like a diaper and run. That's about the only way you could do that. And so, you know, the father didn't care. Didn't care about dignity. Didn't care about those things. He ran to his son. Why? Because his son was home. You notice he runs to him before he even knows why he's back. You know, he runs to him. He wraps his arms around him. He probably stinks a pig. But he loves him, his son. And he says, let's put a robe on him. Let's put a ring on him. Let's put better shoes on his feet. Let's kill the fattened calf. And you know what? They've been fattening up that calf. You know, they've been getting ready for him to come back. He's watching and waiting. And now we're going to celebrate. You see, that's what love does. Love watches for the sinner to return. And God watches for us to return. And when that happens, then the celebration begins. Love comes about and celebration begins. Got a comment from Glenn Powell. He says, primarily sin is against God, and that's very true. It is that. He mentions that it was the perception of Joseph that suggested sin with his wife, Potiphar. That's what he told Potiphar's wife. How can I do this and sin against God? And so, yeah, that's very true, and that's what Glenn has said. That's very right. And it's really amazing that Joseph recognized that all the way back at that early part in the history of mankind, that he recognized that sin was defiling God. Also, to add along with what Glenn said, in Isaiah 51, when David writes the 51st Psalm, and I can't remember which verse it is, but he says, to God, against you and you only have I sinned. Well, that wasn't technically true. David had sinned definitely against Bathsheba. He definitely had sinned against Uriah. He had sinned against his wife, David's wife. He'd sinned against his nation. He'd sinned against a whole bunch of people. But you know what? Who mattered most? What was God? And so he acknowledged that. And yes, sin is always before God and always an affront and an offense against God. And so yes, David recognized that. Joseph recognized that. And here the prodigal son realized, I've sinned and I need to seek forgiveness of that sin. And so love caused him to know that he could go back, that he could be welcomed back. Now, he got welcomed back better than he thought. He thought he was going to get to come back merely as a servant. Instead, he got to come back as a son. He got to come back as a son. He got to be loved by his father. And that's the way God would welcome us if we need to return to him. Now in verse 25. Now the older son was in the field. And he came and he drew near to the house. And he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked him what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and the father has killed the fattened calf, and because he received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. That's probably a little bit of a exaggeration. Never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I may celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured his property with prostitutes, You killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. We need to know that, as Kevin mentioned a little while ago, we should not be like the Pharisees and scribes that we saw early in the chapter that were grumbling against Jesus. We cannot be like them. We must not be like them, and that's what this older brother is doing. But you know what? The older brother could very well look like the Christian that's never really gone into the far country. And they see someone come forward and they get self-righteous and get judgmental and look and say, oh, it's about time. Or what have they done now? Well, some of those judgmental things that the Father could have said. You know, what's interesting to me is all those things that the Father could have said that didn't. You know, like, I told you so. Or like, yep, I knew this would happen. Look what the cat drew again. Or whatever. There's any number of things the Father could have said, but didn't. Would have been justified in saying, but didn't. But instead, he said we need to celebrate. And so we must not be like the older brother. The older brother should have had love, should have had compassion like the Father, and he didn't. You notice also the love in the Father, because the Father goes out, leaves the party, and goes to the older brother to try to encourage him, to try to bring him in. You see, he loves both of his sons. And he wants both of them to be safe, wants both of them to be well, wants both of them to be there. And love is what brought the son back. Now, what's interesting is that the parable ends right there. We don't know whether the older brother went into the party after what the father said to him. We don't know. We don't know for sure whether the younger son stayed in the father's house. He was still a young man. He could have theoretically left again. Because I tell you, he wouldn't be the first prodigal to leave more than once. But the story doesn't end in the way that we might want. All the rest of the story is not given. But you know what? What is there is what we need. So the question is, your story, my story, as long as there's life within us, the story hasn't ended yet. And so the question is, wherever you are, you don't have to end up where you are. So if you find yourself in the pig pen, know this, that the Father wants you and wants you back. Love is calling you and leading you back home. Please answer that call. Please come back to Him. Please join Him. Go back to Him, acknowledge your sin, and He'll take you back. And as His people, as the church, we need to have that kind of compassion and that kind of care and that kind of love that the Father had. And so in which we rejoice when a sinner returns. And so there's much more that we could say about this parable. There really is. But I want us to just get what a great love story this is. That God has loved us enough that He watches and He waits and He runs to us when we come to Him. And so please, please, if you find yourself separated from Him, then certainly come back to Him and realize that God is so wonderful and God is so blessing, such a great blessing to us, and that He gives us so much. Denise Bissett, and I think this is a pretty good way to end it. I'll read her comment to all of us. God gives us free will, as we saw in the beginning. This also allows us to learn. Sometimes we concentrate on what we don't have and not on what we do have, which is more than we need. Yes, we do have more than we need. God is so good to us, and that's very true. If you find yourself in the pig pen, it's not because God is not blessing you. It's because you're probably not living the way you should. If you come to Him, He'll help you and bless you. So always remember the great parable and how that love is the reason why He wants us back. And so answer His love and respond to His love. And if you're not a Christian, we want to hear from you. We'd love you to have you come and become a child of God and come to Him. And we're not going to sing an invitation song because we don't have very many here with us. But know that the invitation's always open. And if you want to reach out to us, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to help you become a child of God. We'd love to pray with you. We'd love to help you in whatever it is that we can help you to get yourself right with God. If you want to study more or learn more about what it takes to become a Christian, we'd love to hear from you by way of email. Send us an email, barrickvillechurch@gmail.com. And we'd love to talk with you about the plan of salvation. We'd love to help you be baptized and get your sins forgiven and be able to be a child of God. We'd want to help you in any way we can. Please, everybody, have a good week. Stay safe, stay warm. We're not supposed to have very good weather for the next few days, so be especially careful if you need to be out and about. Take care, everybody.